all of my work is about pushing back truth to power. And it's about revealing unpalatable truths. It's also about exploring where we've been positioned in society. And as a mad woman made good, if I could call myself a woman these days, and more on that shortly, I have to say it has been crucial to me to be able to express the kind of rage I feel at where I've been positioned in society and where my fellow beings are positioned in society. Can we have the first slide, please, Rupert? Because I'm going to talk about pigtails, which after a spectacular breakdown, and I've had a few, although I like to call them breakthroughs, actually, I wrote a piece called Pigtails. Pigtails was a response to Vital Exposure of Disability Arts Festival, which was way back in 2001. Yeah, I'm 60 years of age, so I've been around plenty of time to be pushing back at some of the powers that be that have meddled with our minds, our hearts, and our lives. So Vital Exposure Disability Arts Festival were looking for new commissions, and they were looking round for who they could bring into their camp. And they were very interested at the time in looking at the flawed body. And that just irritated me because I've been around the disability arts movement for a long, long while, and it's my trusted tribe, I have to say. In the early days, there was a split between those of us with mental health conditions and those of us with physical and sensory impairment, but we got wise to that and decided we're better working together. So that festival, I decided to push back on the concept of the flawed body and atypical bodies. I decided, let's bring in some unruly minds. And I really wanted to write something that was about why my body had become such a disappointment. Not to me, but to my father, actually. So it's very much an autobiographical piece. Pigtails is about a little girl or female sexed child raised as a boy in the context of the Irish Catholic Church and against the backdrop of the mental health system, which I was repeatedly thrown up against throughout my life. And I used a very convenient framework to write this piece of work. The structure was good because it was around that kid's nursery rhyme. You know, what is it, a nursery rhyme or a jingle? This little piggy went to market. So it gives you 5 stories. This little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed at home. This little piggy ate roast beef. This little piggy had none. And this little piggy went wee all the way home. The whole piece is looking at the idiocies of gender fixity. It was deconstructing gender dysphoria inside the mental health system. And that went on stage 2001 and ended up touring internationally. And talk about truth to power, that was a great space to do it. Can we have the next slide, please, Rube? Oh yeah, this gone a little bit pixelated. I quite like the way it's gone, actually, because it looks a bit like a painting or something. I played all of the parts in this piece of work. No better place than the stage to place your rage when you want to push back. On stage, as we look at it, so we're looking at the left-hand side, that's me playing the character of Psychic Seeley, who's also kind of the ultimate femininity. And latched to my breast at the time was the priest, played by Dominic Evan, who I've never seen again. I hope he's okay. I don't know what happened to him after that scene. But yes, it did bring tears to my eyes. And this is also me playing Pig, who is the butcher on the butcher's stall, which transfers into the police cell. And every aspect of that show was literally about stripping away the kind of projections, if you like, of other people's concept of what a woman should be, or what a female sexed person should live like. What are those social roles we need to conform to? And I realized throughout my life, my working life, what I've been doing is literally pushing back. And if I unpick every piece of work I've ever staged, it's literally about failed women, the wrong woman or wrong women, whether that is a queer woman or a queer person, a trans woman, a feminist, a lesbian, you name it, we're all wrong, all of us. We fail at femininity. We fail to perform that kind of social role or the socially constructed kind of job description, if you like. Can we have the next slide, please, Rup? I met a really interesting collaborator in New Zealand. This is part of a festival called Feast, which is the Queer Arts Festival out in Adelaide. And Feast was then run by a guy called Daniel Clark, who is now, I mean, I just heard recently, he's gone stratospheric and is literally running the next World Pride Festival. Let's see how that happens. I hope to God it's not all in Zoom tunes and mosaics online, you know what I mean? And this is a piece called Darby and Joan, which was just a nibble inside the Feast Festival. And we were looking at queer aging. Philip Paxton is a wonderful writer, performer, intellectual mind like a planet. He happens to have cerebral palsy, big deal. What that means for him is he's been positioned in a certain way all the way through his career and academic life. And at this point in time, he's wearing this bright red tutu. You can't quite see it because the net is folded on his lap. And we're positioned like two bookends of bitterness in this care home where these two queer people collide together over a dead body found on the night shift. And Darby and Joan made quite a kerfuffle there. But again, it was about looking at wrong women. You know, there's nothing more wrong than a trans woman. And bang in the middle of us, I don't think you can see it in this image, is the initial Trans Fabulous poster that began in the Star Club in Bethnal Green, one of the first trans festivals here in London. So I just thought I'd sneak that in there in the image for no good reason. Can we have the next slide, please, Rup? With a commission from Dada Festival to make a raw scratch, you know, basically an R&D research and development piece. This was in 2008, so we're moving on a wee while now. I come from Birkenhead, which is very close to Liverpool. It's 10 minutes away on a ferry boat, actually. And I wanted to strip away. 2008 was European Capital of Culture for Liverpool, which was supposed to mean a lot of money and jobs coming into Merseyside. That didn't happen. But anyway, I wanted to look at the reality and strip away that kind of veneer of the kind of, you know, that lovely Liverpool, that city up there in the northwest. It's great, isn't it? Well, it is, but it's built on slavery. It's built on the enslavement of over 20 million African peoples who were taken from that continent. And Liverpool became the biggest slave port in the, what they call the Triangle. Also, Liverpool, perhaps a lesser known fact, enslaved over 90,000 women and girls from Ireland who were used as breed mares to develop the New World, whatever that was going to look like. So I wrote a piece called Crossings, which is essentially a feminist piece of work. It's about sexual slavery. It's also about forced migration. And it's, of course, about the building of the city of Liverpool underneath it all. But actually at the heart of this, these are stories from women's lives that I found on museum walls. To the right of the screen is Hetty May Bailey, who's a superb BSL, British Sign Language consultant. That's also her projected on the screen at the back. To the left of her is Margot Cargill, a brilliant actor, who at the time approached me and said, you know, I've only ever been in the ensemble. I've never had a lead role. That's because she's blind. And I thought, why don't we build the physicality of the set around you and we'll write a lead role for you, Margot. She did brilliantly there, playing Nzinga, who is the voice of conscience at the heart of this ghost ship. It's like a modern day Scrooge, where this young girl who we see on the left, played by Nadine Well-Palmer, 15-year-old Shelley, is 8 months pregnant and desperate to get away from the gang who had impregnated her. But she's only known the gang in all of her teenage years. This is from real stories from kids who've been working on the docks there in Liverpool. And that's me sort of in the middle to the left of Margot, playing Hegarty, which was a story I found on the walls of a museum called Petone Settlers Museum near Paikokariki on the North Island in New Zealand. And Hegarty came from Derry in the north of Ireland, and was taken through Liverpool, literally, to be impregnated, but she stole her twin brother's identity on board the ship that took her when he died. And she didn't want to be kind of used as a ship's whore or used as a breed mare. So there's an extraordinary story of what happened to Catherine Hegarty, who became a pirate essentially, alongside Charlotte Badger. Oh, they were wrong women, all right, but my God, they made it work for them. And this particular story actually landed me an award with ITV. So I ended up working for a wee while with ITV's story, they call it story department. I don't remember. It doesn't matter what they call it really, because I left after 3 weeks. I'd had enough. I was definitely the wrong woman in the wrong game there. I don't really appreciate soap operas. I'm passionate about social justice. And as you can see, I needed to write my own piece and not be in a team of writing monkeys. It didn't quite work for me. So forgive me. I made an arsehole of that particular gift of ITV. I do apologise. Can we move on to the next slide, please? This is a piece called The Knitting Circle, and I have to say it's probably the biggest piece of work I've ever done in my life. And it started off a long, long time ago when I decided I was going to train as a drama therapist. And actually, I'm just thinking about that. It's quite interesting because I didn't make the decision. The psychiatrists who were looking after me at the time, when I was in St Anne's Hospital in Nottingham. I don't know whether it still exists. I don't much care, really. You know, you don't go back, do you, when the TripAdvisor's visit doesn't improve things in the star rating? You're not going to return. Anyway, the Knitting Circle is based on a women's group I ran in an old asylum. And by that, I mean one of the old big bins, the long care system. And I lived and worked there for 2 years. I was supposed to be on placement. I didn't tell you who made the decision I should become a drama therapist. It was a particular psychiatrist who said, I think you're a wee bit sensitive for theatre. And I think it might help you to do something like arts therapies. I think you might find that kinder on the way you perceive the world and how you process your emotional reactions. So I had a look at it and I thought, well, it'll do me no harm. And actually, it would help me dismantle, take apart what that treatment had done to me or done for me. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. So the training in drama therapy has really helped me through the years because it taught me much about power and abuse of power in group contexts. I was obliged to be in analysis 3 times a week. And that poor woman who was my analyst, God love her, I hope she's still alive, I loathed her. And I said to her on the first session, I'm really sorry, but I hate you. And she said, that's a very good place to start. Let's have a look at that because we've only just met. And I thought, wow, this woman's great. She's so brave. I'm going to stick with her. So I ended up kind of becoming quite fond of her, but I didn't like to admit it. Anyway, I continued in there doing 3 days a week analysis, group therapy and training in all of the different aspects of how we unpick and unpack the damages of our socialization. And I decided in my first placement, where I was for 3 months in a place called Harperbury Hospital, that I was not going to abandon those women. I was not going to abandon the majority of those people in a 2,000-bed self-sufficient village that was actually originally built by the Quakers for a kind of sanctuary, but that had been used by successive governments to contain and control people who were effectively out of order, social misfits. Many, many, many I met there should never have been incarcerated at all. The majority of people in there were women. I worked with women on the lock-in wards. Ward 7 was the naughty critters. They were the ones I was supposed to be scared of. They were the ones I felt I had most akin with. And I worked on the context of a little clinic unit there called SEAC, the Social Education and Assessment Centre. So I was refused initially permission to run a women's group. And then I persuaded Sister Mary Frances in the old school of that system. There was the sister was always the, you know, top dog, basically. She said what goes. And she said, you'll never be able to run a women's group in here. It's too political. But you could run a knitting circle. So I said, why would I do that? I can't even knit. She said, oh, it doesn't matter. I know a woman who can. I'll release Nan Sweeney in Ward 7. Now, Nan Sweeney could knit for Ireland. I have to say I've changed her name to protect her surviving family and also to hold on to her dignity because, honest to God, she was amazing. So I ran a women's group called the Knitting Circle. Some years ago in 2010, I discovered an old cassette tape. For those of you who think this is way out of what is that, is, you know, do we have them in museums? No, we used to use these little plastic cassettes with ribbon inside. And when it went wrong, you put a pencil in and wound it tight. But it actually recorded the voices of the women in that knitting group. And I found that tape in my basement. I played it until I'm afraid I overstretched it and it rotted, what have you. It's no longer functions. But I transcribed the voices and I decided I would write a play, but I didn't want it just to be my memory or those voices of that small group of people. So what I did was I put a call out. I got in touch with Survivors Speak Out, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Survivors Poetry, National Mind, Regional Minds, anyone who had been through the system, mental health system survivors, CAPO, Campaign Against Psychiatric Oppression, Disability Arts Online, Disability Arts in London. I mean, anyone and anybody who I could link up with, and I put words out. This is what I was doing. I wanted to hear your stories. Very swiftly, I was flooded with stories from people who had literally never been heard, hadn't had anywhere where they could tell what had happened to them inside those big bins in the asylums during those years that were supposed to be locked they were supposed to be emptied and closed down in the early 80s. They weren't. Harbury Hospital, where I used to live and work, is still open. It's a much smaller concern, but it's still built on the old 2,000 bed village. That was, they changed the name to Kingsley Green. Doesn't that sound much more palatable? But anyway, it is still there. So some of those asylums were demolished, some of them didn't. You know, they're still with us in some shape or form. So in my feel out, I got, in the end, over 70 stories, which was a bit overwhelming. I had to create composite characters and I wrote a play. I put out feelers to cast 6 actors. I wanted them to have experience of the mental health system in some shape or form. Sorry, I don't know who this is. They can go. I thought the phone was off. Forgive me. That's now recorded for posterity. So can I just say, if we're in a time capsule, that used to be called a mobile phone. Right, moving back, I cast 6 actors with their own experience or with family experience, or we had one person who had worked in the systems during the decant years when Margaret Thatcher became, ironically, an icon of social justice for emptying those big asylums. In fact, what she was doing was making money out of the property development and putting no resources whatsoever in the community. So I cast 6 actors eventually, with 6 former patients, 6 former members of staff. We had very careful safeguards in place to make sure people weren't damaged by this and re-triggered by their previous experiences. The Knitting Circle came to the stage in 2011 and it literally sold out everywhere we took it. It ended up touring for 18 months. And we returned to the stories 3 years ago to make a documentary called Voices from the Knitting Circle. And Voices from the Knitting Circle was literally going back to those storytellers who were still alive. Some sadly had died because they were in their late 70s and 80s when they were contacting me, you know. I have remained in contact with some of the people who gave me the gifts of their stories. I feel I've become a careful kind of curator of the most extraordinary life experiences. I met some very brave whistleblowers from the staff teams who I'm still in contact with. And I met people who had colluded with extraordinary damage inside those places and who had worked for the rest of their lives to make changes, because they'd started when they were very young, when they'd worked inside that system. So the Knitting Circle, I believe, has been probably the most significant piece of social activism, creative activism in a theatre space that I've ever created. At the time of putting that out on stage, we timed it to match with the apology that was given by Taoiseach Enda Kenny. Taoiseach is the Irish word for Prime Minister, in the Dial in Dublin. And he gave his apology on the 19th of February 2013. And we were still on stage with the Knitting Circle then. So I made sure that we continued the apology. We made our apology to the thousands of people who were locked away. And literally they threw away the key when people were in that system. Look, some people benefited, I'm sure, but, you know, send me a postcard and tell me about it. Most people were very damaged by having their lives literally contained in those big bins, and they never saw the light of air again in many ways, didn't meet with their families again. So we continued and we made our apologies, and I've written about this. It's about to be published in a book called Creative Activism by, I've forgotten her name now, Elspeth Tilley over in New Zealand. I'll tell you more when I find out. There'll be a link for you at some point anyway. Can we have the next slide, please? Right, this is from a piece of work. Now, I want to say, what is wrong with this woman? This woman is fabulous. I love everything about this image. And if you're somebody out there with a visual impairment, I have to say, on the left of this image we're looking at is Claire Ryan, who is 6'2", Maori Irish, from New Zealand. Obviously, I've done a lot of work in New Zealand, but this is actually in Islington. This particular piece was from a piece called Snow White and the Seven Whores, in which I had to fight my mother off because she wanted to be the head whore. We wouldn't allow it, obviously. And here in this image, Claire, very voluptuous, has got her black and white checked long leggings on. She's got a pink tutu. She's wearing a black plastic basque she's just about spilling out of. Voluptuous, enormous bosom spilling over the pub bar, and bright red nail varnish on, and her hair is up in bright red dreadlocks, black glasses, and she's got some kind of big dog collar around her neck with a big link on. She's literally waiting to be grabbed and taken away. And right in front of her is a black cat o' nine tails whip. I can't see the length of it, but some of it's spilling over the bar. And ironically, nearby, an apple. And I feel the apple is symbolic. You know, in terms of Christian mythology, it was all Eve's fault. So we've been wrong women just by being born with vaginas, those of us with our own vaginas. What more can I say about Claire Ryan? This was great casting as the head whore in Snow White and the Seven Whores, because Claire Ryan was somebody who was literally vilified for her work over in New Zealand, because she was working with Creative Ideas New Zealand, matching up sex workers, those people who self-identify as sex workers. I know some people do not. And people who they had called revolving door patients or revolving door offenders, because they'd come through the mental health system and the criminal justice system, and they kept getting into trouble. Most of them were discovered were people with learning disabilities who'd never been given any adult education, never had any kind of discussion with them about the difference between sensuality and sexuality. They had offended, I guess, acts of public indecency, allegedly. I mean, some of them I thought sounded quite interesting. There was one guy who was very into rubber Wellingtons, and he used to masturbate in a Wellington in the local Woolies. Well, you know, whatever turns you on. But frankly, not a lot of people want to be watching that, do they? No. So her project was to bring people together to educate, to start to talk about healthy adult sexual relationships and what's private and what's public. I know we're all getting confused about that now, because you are literally in my bedroom and we haven't discussed this. So I don't know whether you consent to be in my bedroom or not. So I put this green sheet up behind me. I hope that's all right. But you know what I mean? In these Zoom tombs, in this world where most stuff is going online, you're in my very private space, but we're kind of in public. So, you know, there's going to be a reality check for us all. And I'm thinking back to some of those poor souls who kept going in and out of the criminal justice system because they just got it wrong. And yes, here is the original wrong woman, because she was utterly vilified for putting public funding into that, what I thought was a really brave project, but brilliant idea, because it actually gave people information. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Let Me Stay was the next piece of work I did, which was, well, ironically, because my mother all of her life had wanted to be at the heart of my work, and I'd managed to kind of stave her off for as many years as possible. And that time when she wanted to be the head whore in Snow White and the Seven Whores, I really thought it was quite sad that I couldn't include her in some way. I mean, we did film an advert for her, but that wasn't going to cut it for her because she wanted to be the star of the show. So given that her own condition had spilled beyond, look, my mother had been mad all of her life kind of thing, I believe it was about poverty. I believe it was about trauma, and that actually what she was living with was some kind of dissociation. But she was one of the funniest women I've ever met. I say was because she died 2 years ago, sadly. I mean, I think she was ready to die, but there we are. But we made a piece of work together. She had Alzheimer's, or she had that diagnosis, for 16 years. She would come and go, you know, sometimes she was with us, sometimes she wasn't. But she became kind of the essence. She was condensed to the absolute OXO cube of Julie McNamara. And she was a joy to work with. So I decided I would put her centre stage. I had to work very carefully with her guardian, I suppose they call them now, a legal advocate anyway. Interestingly, we were not allowed to be her legal advocate or guardian, because the hospital that took her in, when the neighbours finally, they rang for an ambulance, excuse me, and took her in, it's something that we would never have wanted, but she was taken into an EMI unit for elderly mentally ill. And once you have somebody of that age locked up in there, you ain't getting them back, or at least that's what I discovered in Liverpool. But I would go in and regularly get stories from her. She chose the name of the show, the title of it. She chose the beginning and the end of the show. For 15 years, we had the joy of a dear friend of mine, Charlotte Kim Yonchu, who I used to run the Disability Film Festival with at the BFI down here in London. He had fallen in love with her as a subject, and he'd filmed her over years. And so we have massive amount of footage of her. So we grabbed clips from that footage that he had, and she chose the clips that went into this play. Let Me Stay is a line from her favourite song. I interacted with her on stage. We had her literally live streamed and projected. We also had pre-recorded film. So we managed to kind of smuggle the essence of her out of that care home. And she joined us by projection. She joined us by pre-recorded film. And we had her voice recordings as well, because she had the sweetest singing voice. And she was very much a part of that show. She led that show. And I have to say, I had a great role model. She was the original wrong woman. And when I look back carefully, her mother, my grandmother, Greta Minto, was the absolute blueprint of the wrong woman. None of them did as they were told. They were all failing to perform femininity, although my mother was high femme, so she knew how it was performative, but certainly failed to conform. And in this show, we literally stripped apart the negative trope of a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. She celebrated with such joy. There were times when she got anxious and she got worried. She was concerned about her bulbs. Suddenly they would grow in the garden. She didn't remember who'd planted them or how had they grown so quickly. There were moments when she felt pained that she couldn't remember incidents in her youth. But I have to say, I was delighted. She had a blessing in her version of Alzheimer's, because every day was a party just for her. In the left-hand side, there's two images up here. On the left is the show, which is like a fragmented kind of metaphor of a brain. And each one of those packing boxes, it's like we had put a memory, an object, a slide, or something of Shirley McNamara in there. And the joy of it was, on the very last day of the last performance of nearly 2 years on stage, and this piece of work toured Ireland, it toured care homes in the Northwest. It toured policy and development makers, you know, Alzheimer's Europe, AIDS UK, blah, blah. So that people could start to understand, well, perhaps it's not just a negative story. We need to have a look at, you know, living well with dementia and different types of dementia. And Shirley Mac was an absolute joy in the stories she told us, the songs she sang, and the thrill, the glee, the mischief with which we presented this story. And on the very last day, we were in Mariners Village, which is a dementia village just on the edge of the Mersey, literally overlooking the river. And my mother had seen a leaflet. Somebody had taken it into her care home, and she said, "You're not doing that without me. I'm coming too." So I got permission for her to be released. We took her out. My sister and my niece sat either side of her in the audience, and it was an absolute pleasure because there were quite a few people there with some kind of dementia who joined in. It was a full house, and that was the last show. And she stood up the end and she said, "Thank you, my audience." And we brought her up on stage. I said, "This is the real star of the show, the wrong woman herself." And she took her bows and said to everybody, "I am a star at last. I am a star." And there wasn't a dry eye in the house, I have to say. On the right-hand side, that is a replica dress of a dress in the 1960s that Shirley wore in a portrait that we use in the show with all of these objects to recall. Roop, could I have the next slide, please? This is one of my favourite wrong women's. This image here is me sat on Kath Duncan's scooter while she's taking the photo. And on the right of this image is Rachel High. Rachel High is one of Australia's national treasures. This is somebody who happens to have Down syndrome, who always says to me, "I wish people would look past the Downs." She's an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary actor, filmmaker. And at the moment, she's just finishing off her BA honours degree at Flinders University after 4 years, which she said, "Oh, it was slow." But what's wrong with slow? She changed my practice, actually, because we were doing a piece of work called, what was it called? It's just left my head. Oh, Steak and Chelsea Out to Lunch. And we were working here in London. We decided to put it on a Brady Arts Centre down at Whitechapel. And Rachel has the habit of slowing down after lunch. I have to say, I've learned the hard way. Don't eat noodles at lunch. Don't overload the carbs because we all just want to sleep. Siesta's a great idea. Anyway, I got antsy with her and I said, "We've got to get back to the studio. You know, time is money. Time is everything. So Rachel, can we move?" And she turned to me and said, "No." What's wrong with slow? And it suddenly hit me. It hit me in the gut, actually. I thought, wow, every message she gets in her life, almost every day, these microaggressions are about her being slow and that slow is wrong. And I thought, I've only added to that pain. And actually, I've been doing it all week, moving too fast, moving at the city pace. And actually, Rachel doesn't come from the city. She doesn't come from London, you know. She is somebody who came up to me in a bar when I was doing Pigtails, the first slideshow I showed you at the beginning. And she came up to me in the bar and she said to me, "You're going to be my mentor." And I very patronisingly said, "Oh, that's a lovely idea, but I live a long, long way away." And she looked at me and she went, "Yeah, I know. I was born in Middlesex. My dad is English. My mum is English. They were both £10 plums. We happen to live in Australia, but you're coming here to mentor me here. I will go and get my director. She will get money. You will come here, but not here in Melbourne. You will meet me in Adelaide, and that is where we will work." She walked away and I thought, my God, she's a force to be reckoned with. She got the money. And for 2 years running, I went out to Adelaide to work with her and we produced that piece. So eventually, when she came back to England, she was making her way to Ireland and she had been chosen as the keynote speaker at the World Congress on Down syndrome. Not a great title, but you know what? Got us the money, got Rach over here. Next slide, please. Thank you, Rupert. So we have stayed in touch. Probably Rachel is one of my longest collaborators. This is a piece of work called Tit for Tat Tattoos, which we did in both Melbourne and in Adelaide. Rachel was part of a whole troupe that we were invited to join. Quippings was the queer crip troupe out there in Melbourne, run by Kath Duncan and Jackie Brown. And I think they've got a whole collective now, so forgive me for the other names that I can't remember. But this is us literally working together. We're doing our, we've got to practice our Cupid's bows. So that's me playing Sleazy Slick on the left, and Rachel is playing Princess on the right. She came up with this title, Tit for Tat Tattoos, in which she strips me down, removes part of a false breast. I've had an operation, that's another story, which she strips out and then tattoos my body in front of the audience. It's about the social contract of the female body. It's also about the element of surprise, because I'll tell you something, when we were rehearsing this, I had no clue what she was going to do with her tattoo pen. Thankfully, it was a felt pen. I was able to rub it out afterwards, but I did look at it and think, should I have that tattooed? Rachel is, again, one of the ultimate wrong women who has always been kind of positioned as wrong simply because she has an extra chromosome. She's one of my favourite collaborators, and we together are still shocking audiences with the work we do as women who fail to perform femininity and people who fail to conform. And I would say theatre is a very good place to start positioning and staging our creative activism and push back truth to power. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Julie Mac. So much in there. And I have all kinds of questions that I could ask, but I'm wondering if Abby or anyone from the audience had anything they wanted to kick off with first. Abby, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. It was honestly so inspiring. All of your work had so much power, and I found it really empowering to see you talk about it. And yeah, thank you so much. It's so bold. You're really inspiring. I was looking at the reflections, and you can see like everyone's really like loved your work so much, and your talk.
Thank you, that means a lot to me. So I can't see people, which is a bit distressing. It's a bit weird. I can see you two now in little mosaic cubes, but any feedback is very welcome. And if you want a copy of that slideshow, you're very welcome.
Oh, that would be amazing, yeah.
Yeah, listen, my brain's here, it's too heavy. Pick it clean, will you?
Just to say, we've turned on gallery view, so you can see some people if you want to check. If you want to change it to gallery view.
Yeah, I do. I hate feeling
like it's nice. Yeah, it's nice to see people.
Yeah.
I'll turn on mine and be brave as well. It was so good, and thanks for being so clear on the slides for me as well.
Rupert, thanks for your help.
Brilliant.
I have a question. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Julie Mac. That has been fantastic, taking us through the richness and the depth of your work. And actually, I have many questions, I think, at some level, but maybe it takes time to formulate all of them. But my main question is something around, given the theme of the conference, Future in Mental Health, whether you think your work obviously is a great work of advocacy and, as you say, talking to power. Do you think as theatrical work, not as drama therapy, does it have any therapeutic effect, do you think, for people who watch?
To be honest, I bloody hate that concept where I'm linked to therapy so swiftly. So I'm going to push that back right now. I did train as a drama therapist. I never registered. I decided that it was too privileged, and that actually what I wanted to do was create more social justice and find ways to use work that gave people tools themselves so that they could push back.
Maybe at like 12, 11:30, 11, maybe it's 11.
Sorry?
I think that has been.
Sorry about that. We just had a bit of sound crossover. That happens when anyone.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happens at 11:30, but I'm in.
I think Abby was having a very important phone call. But don't worry, we've got it.
What I would say is, I guess the most important thing for me has been what it did for people who told their stories and saw their stories on stage. One of the most moving moments for me was witnessing 4 women on the 8th of May at the closing of the Bristol Festival in 2013. And those 4 women had come from Erratum, this long care place out West Country. And I invited anyone who wanted to take to the stage. And they came on, sat down, and they thanked everyone for coming to see their play. 2 things on that. One is the ownership. Yes, it is theirs. It's their story. It's their play. I loved that. That really touched me. And the other was they had the bravery to come on stage and sit there and face people and say, this is my life. This is my story. And thank you for coming. So I have no doubt there's been therapeutic benefits if we have to use those words.
I'll take your point. I'll think about the word again. Maybe it needs some problematizing.
Yeah, it's
Right.
probably my stuff.
Abby, did you want to, as I said, I have a couple of questions, but Abby, I think there's a question from Harry. Maybe you just want to unmute and ask it yourself, Harry.
Oh, yeah, no worries, it's totally fine. Yeah, so you mentioned wanting to avoid re-triggering the women in the knitting circle, and I thought that was it's something that I worry about a lot, is like, how do I avoid harming people who have been harmed while also educating people who haven't had those lived experiences on the realities of how painful they are? How do you balance that?
You know what? Very, very carefully. And I have made one big mistake, and I always learn by my mistakes. But we had a confidentiality policy, so everybody had to preserve the identity and the whereabouts of everyone we spoke to. We only met on neutral spaces. We made sure that each of the people we spoke to had a support worker. In terms of the cast that I worked with, I made sure that we had access to counselling. And I learned that the hard way, by the way. That was my mistake. And that was actually from another piece of work when I was working with, for 2 years, I worked with children with mental health issues who'd survived violence at home or violence in the country of origin. And we worked really carefully to have children's champions in board. We had counselling for the kids. We had very careful work with the families. We made sure there were positive role models as well as the kids who were surviving violence. But what I'd forgotten was a counsellor for the cast. And this show has been on the road for 8 years now. And we've continually changed the cast. But actually, I'd forgotten that the cast were hearing these fresh disclosures, new stories, every time we took the show out. So I made a boo-boo there. So I'd suggest that you think carefully about, if there is the possibility of emotional harm, how can we support people to talk it through, or find them the right places to go and talk? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
don't take it all on yourself. I had to look out for myself as well during the whole process.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think we have another question in the chat from Melissa. Would you like to ask yourself, or should I read it out?
Yeah, sure. I can ask that question. I was curious to kind of like find solutions for our current times for COVID, and I was wondering if you could speak into how we can look at creative activism and continue to innovate more.
I think we're still in it, aren't we? So we're making it up as we go along. I was working at the very beginning of this lockdown. I had a job offer to be in Melbourne and I couldn't take it up, obviously, because they wouldn't let me fly. So I had huge disappointment, and it's changed the life I thought I'd have, but that's my stuff. So I threw myself in there to do whatever I could, particularly with mental health system survivors and disabled people who I felt were just getting left off the agenda. And there's an activist called Dolly Sen, who you may have heard of. Her work is superb. Please look her up. She has been decried for doing a TripAdvisor review on the Maudsley Hospital, which, if you can find, is hilarious. You have to look for it. They didn't do very well in the TripAdvisor review, I have to say. I think they got 1 star. So she got in touch with me and said, I want to section the Department of Work and Pensions because they're killing disabled people. Will you help me section them? And I said, yes, I think it should be done. So I dressed as a psychiatric nurse. She was dressed as the doctor. We had Jan Gallagher with us, and the 3 of us went to section the Department of Work and Pensions. And of course, they weren't expecting us because everyone was in lockdown. So we took a load of police hazard tape with us. We decided it should be a 136 section because we knew the police had arrived at some point. And we went there at 8:30 in the morning when there was very few people around. And we actually met with the Secretary of State, who was terrified, confronted with us. And we were trying to explain to her, look, we're just 3 mad women, so what could be so frightening? Do you know what I mean? And we're all pretending to be doctors. We're not really doctors. What could be so frightening? And this tape is only tape. You can actually cut it. You're not really being sectioned. It's make-believe, but we're making a gesture here this morning. Dolly was brilliant because she wore a stethoscope and she was listening out for a heart in the building. And she said, I don't think there's a heart in this building. And we had pre-prepared, or Dolly had pre-prepared, this wonderful prescription of what the DWP needed to proceed in the future and to actually include, not just during lockdown or pandemic, but actually whenever we need a PIP or whenever we need some kind of investigation, work capability assessment, etc. I mean, I can't believe we've actually grown up assessment centres in plain sight in the middle of our cities, and we've allowed this to happen, you know. Anyway, we sectioned the DWP and we drew quite a lot of attention, and a very lovely dykey policewoman was sent out of the van because the boys were too afraid to talk to us. And she came out and she said, look, ladies, we were like, 3 of us looked at each other. I don't think we'd ever been called ladies. We looked at each other. Do you mind moving on? Because you've caused quite a stir and they need to go about their business. And we were like, no, we think job done, but do you mind being photographed? She went, no, I'm quite happy to be photographed. So we had a photo with her. Anyway, I think as we go forward, we're dreaming up new possibilities for creative activism in the current context. Watch this space. Dolly's about to do something in the next few weeks. I can't disclose that. That would absolutely blow the gaff. It will hit the national press. We're dreaming up all sorts. There's a book called Lockdown Pie, which is a wonderful piece of activism from elderly people in Kilburn who've been talking about their isolation and their griefs and also their joys, because we have to hold on to the small pleasures. We're still in it. Surrender is not an option. No surrender.